like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to extend that respect to any elders or emerging leaders from Aboriginal other nations who may be here this evening. My name's Sophie Lieberman and I'm the Head of Public Programs and Education here at ACMI, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you this evening to our fifth in the ACMI Conversation series, The Psychology of Fear, which we conveniently programmed on Halloween. I'll hand over in just a quick second to our chair and panel, but before we do, I invite you to participate in the conversation using the hashtag. And if you haven't already, I also invite you to consider being at our next ACMI conversation, which is going to be on superheroes, ethics and justice. So more goodness to delve into. But for this evening, we're interested in answering the question, in our uncertain era full of real-life horror, what is driving our appetite for true crime and fascination with the macabre? We have a panel who I think are going to help illuminate many different answers to that question. So I will welcome Emma Westwood, who is a film writer and commentator. She's the author of 2 books on cinema, Monster Movies and The Fly, a monograph on David Cronenberg's 1986 remake. Emma has written about cinema and the arts for numerous publications, and she also co-hosts the weekly film criticism show Plato's Cave on 3RRR. Thank you so much for being here, Emma. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, without further ado, I'll introduce the panellists. They're the far more interesting ones than me on this panel. So I have at the far end of the panel, Penelope Thomas, who is a project manager of applied industry research at AFTRS in Sydney. She has managed a number of research projects for the school, including VR Noir, which premiered at Vivid Ideas 2016. Her current projects include Biometrics on audience engagement, the AFTRS CSIRO Data61 Media Index, and Precipice, a binaural, have I said that right? Narrative podcast project in collaboration with the Sydney Philharmonic Orchestra. Sydney Philharmonic Choirs, WNYC New York Public Radio, and BBC's Audio Science Research Unit, which premiered at Vivid 2017. So I also have Professor Nick Haslam, and Nick is Professor of Psychology at the University of Melbourne. A graduate of the University of Melbourne, he received his PhD in Clinical and Social Psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1993 and taught at the New School for Social Research in New York for several years before returning to Australia in 2002. Nick's research interests include personality, social perception and psychiatric classification, and he's published extensively in these areas. In addition to his academic writing, Nick contributes regularly to The Conversation, where he is a columnist, and Australian Book Review, and he has also written for The Monthly, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Australian, and 2 Best Australian Science Writing anthologies. Nick is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, a former member of the ARC College, do you say ARC? ARC. A former head of the School of Psychological Sciences at this university and current president of the Society of Australasian Social Psychologists. And then directly beside me is Rosie Jones, an award-winning documentary writer, director and editor. Her most recent film, which we'll be talking about a bit tonight, is The Family, an investigative work about the notorious Hamilton Burn cult that premiered at the Melbourne International Film Festival in 2016. Previous films from Rosie include The Triangle Wars, about an epic struggle over development on an iconic Australian foreshore, my homeland of St Kilda. Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery, an investigation of Australia's biggest mass UFO sighting, and Obsessed with Walking, an exploration of psychogeography with writer Will Self. She has also edited numerous documentaries commissioned by Australian and international broadcasters. So please welcome them here tonight. Thank you, guys. So I just wanted to ask first, I'm intrigued by why you're all here tonight. So who has a fascination with the macabre or the horrific? You say, don't be scared. Come on, everybody. Keep your hands up if you're willing to tell me where you think that comes from. No? No one's willing? So I'm going to have to tell you why I think I am into it. Okay. All right. First of all, I think everyone is very different when it comes to what scares them, basically. But broadly speaking, there's a whole lot of scary things that we sort of all buy into. That sort of comes about in trends. And at the moment, we've got this creepy clown trend that's going on with the rise of Stephen King's It being remade, and also that's come about generating an interest in Stephen King's works again as well. But another trend is true crime, and that's something that's our hook today, and particularly we'll be hearing from Rosie about that with her brilliant documentary on Anne Hamilton Byrne and the Melbourne cult known as The Family. But largely this trend of true crime has really come about at the moment thanks to the long-form investigative storytelling that's been made available through online streaming services. It's not a new thing by any means, but it's kind of taken on a new form. There's been a lot of trends like this in the past, something like Satanic Panic from the 80s. I don't know whether anyone here would know about that. Hopefully I'll get to show you a clip at the end of this presentation to sort of end on a light note in case we've scared the hell out of you. But anyway, first I'd like to sort of present myself as the guinea pig here, and I'll just see if I can move this on. There you go. All right. So I wrote a book on monster movies where I interviewed a filmmaker who's called Adam Simon. He said something that really resonated with me. He's made a doco on horror movies called The American Nightmare, and he references it in what I'm about to read to you. So he says, as a filmmaker, I think horror is one of those forms, monsters in particular, that people select early on, or it selects them. Mysteries are a bit that way too, in the way that people writing them or making them tend to be great consumers of mysteries to begin with, which isn't true of all genre forms. The documentary I made, Adam Simon talking, The American Nightmare, was partly an attempt for me to answer the question, why was it that at the age of 8 through to 12, an age when you're most receptive to ideas, was I drawn to horror movies? Who knows? People can go off with a whole lot of psychological ideas of why. Almost every kid goes through a stage of liking dinosaurs or enormous creatures. There's certainly something that comes from the experience of being a small creature in a world of large, powerful, dominant giants that have control over your fate. I think some movies, and this applies more narrowly to monsters than to horror in general, often play with issues of scale and size. That might seem obvious, but we underestimate the fact that our sense of the world comes from our embodiment within it. And not only do we begin very small, but we begin in a state of almost constant metamorphosis. We experience our bodies in all kinds of bizarre ways as children, and we are, in a way that we will never be again, surrounded by members of the species that are of a vastly different size. That in itself is somewhat monstrous. So I think this really applies to me. This is actually my family up here on the screen. Not the family that you wrote, no, not that family. They're really actually quite a very normal family, although that might look kind of strange. Strangely normal in a normal dysfunctional sense, I should say. So what we have here is, that's my grandfather up the back, my mother and father in the middle. I'm the little one. So I'm the little one in the monstrous, the monstrous setting. My grandmother's there, and this guy's called Peghead, right? Now Peghead was, it wasn't creepy like Peghead came for dinner and hung out and watched TV or anything like that. Peghead was actually an invention of my uncle's. He liked to do strange photographic works, and this was one of the creators, him and his best, one of the creations him and his best friend made to take photographs of, and this is one that he decided to take photographs of with us. There was another character called Rocket Man, and he took off for the moon and never came back again. That's what was explained to me. I kind of wanted him to come back, but he never came back. So, as you can imagine, I was fascinated with Peghead. I think I was about 3 there, so it's quite an interesting exposure. And you know, what child wouldn't be? I mean, I think kids are always really interested in the magical and the make-believe and what doesn't seem real or part of that, of their actual reality. So maybe Adam Simon actually does have a point when he says that, you know, children are sympathetic to monsters because in essence they are monsters, really. Or maybe children are just more imaginative, really. It could be just as simple as that. But also as a kid, my partner in crime was my cousin Chris, who was a week difference in age to me. And we fancied ourselves as spies and investigators, private investigators, and we had sort of all manner of secret plans. I don't know really what we were planning, but we had them, and we'd set booby traps and we'd do surveillance from trees and things like that. And my grandmother actually lived opposite a what was essentially a refugee hostel. I don't know whether they were new immigrants to Australia. It was kind of like a much nicer version of Manus Island on Australian soil in the 1960s. And these huts, by the time I was around in the 70s, these had all been abandoned. All the inhabitants had been placed in homes. So there were just these cylindrical half huts that were empty, and they had a playground at the front. And my grandmother decided that she didn't want us hanging around there in these empty huts. So she actually showed us a photo fit of a criminal from the newspaper and told us that it was a bad man that was hanging around in the hostel. And this idea was to deter us so we wouldn't go there. But it had absolutely the opposite effect. Then we were so much more determined to go to the hostel because we thought we'd capture the bad man, because we really fancied ourselves to be these, you know, I don't know, spies, private investigators, mini James and Jane Bonds in the making. So this sort of thing all progressed to loving, you know, horror, true crime, everything on screen. And it started with an unsupervised watching of The Exorcist at age 11, and I watched it by myself, and then I watched it again straight afterwards, slightly obsessed. Advent of VHS, you know, it allowed a whole lot of discovery, sought out everything that was weird and wonderful, watched movie marathons, rewound the gory bits over and over again with Peghead, well, in his other form, aka Ross. And basically, you know, this is where I've developed an interest that has actually become a professional interest, and I write about horror movies in this day and age. Another cousin, not the one that was into spying with me, but another cousin said to a friend, said to his manager at work, told him what I was into and what I was interested in, and his manager said, "Your cousin needs serious help." He actually said serious help. I'm wondering, Nick, do I need serious help? Am I deranged?
I can't tell yet. Peghead does provide some evidence, and I need to give you a very expensive set of psychological tests to know for sure. But look, I think it sounds like you came out pretty much just fine in spite of all of this, and maybe you just didn't let go of some of the tendencies that you had, whereas most of us have it beaten out of us at some point.
Well, exactly that. How do you think, do I fit from what I've said, the profile of someone who would be into this sort of thing, or, you know, is there another way? Can people come at this from a whole lot of different psychological angles?
Yeah, look, I think there's no single profile, at least what limited research has been done on the sorts of people who like gore and the macabre. There's been some really interesting work in England on dimensions of entertainment preferences, and people tend to find there's about 5 fundamental ways in which people differ in the kinds of culture that turns them on. And what horror movies tends to, liking for them tends to relate to is this broader dimension that's called a dark dimension. And the dark dimension essentially involves preference for horror movies, cult movies of other sorts, but also goes with things like liking edgier music, more angular, aggressive music. It also goes with liking erotica. It has a slew of correlations with people's personality characteristics. So you find that people who tend to like darker genres of culture, they tend to be a little bit less cooperative, a little bit more defiant, a little bit more rebellious.
Okay.
The sorts of people who don't do what their mothers say in terms of going to places where bad men are known to inhabit.
Yeah. Kind of people who work for themselves.
Could be that as well.
Can't subscribe to one boss. No, thank you.
But but also more imaginative. Have higher in a dimension we call openness to experience, where people are a little bit more sort of open to fantasy, a bit more intellectual in their interests. There's no relationship whatsoever between liking dark culture and being more neurotic. You're neither healthy or unhealthier in that regard. I mean, these are just averages, so you might be different. So, look, there's, I think in answer to your question, there is a sort of average profile, but people can come at this from all sorts of reasons, probably some quite healthy and creative, and probably others a bit less so, and maybe more obsessed. But the short answer is there's just a kind of dark dimension underlying a lot of it. I think one of the interesting things from that research, if you let me just go on a bit further about it, liking horror movies isn't only about loving the darkness. People who tend to like them also score somewhat higher than average on a dimension called communal, which is sort of liking sorts of culture which involve some sort of interpersonal drama. So it's not just solitary, there's not just one person stabbing herself. There's other people involved. And that's sort of the interpersonal drama of it, I think, is part of the attraction. And there's also a fourth dimension called the thrill dimension, or thrilling dimension, which involves seeking excitement and novelty and thrills. And people who like horror movies tend to be of that sort as well. They like novelty, they like sensation. They don't have a very high tolerance for boredom.
Okay, yes. Attention deficiency, that's me. Now, Pen, I'll pass this over to you so you can work with it. But maybe you can, first, your work with biometrics, can we say that you are actually interested in horror and the macabre, or are you not?
We can empirically say that you are engaged while you are watching it. We don't necessarily, we can't necessarily be definite about the type of engagement, the valence of that engagement. We can make inferences against what you're actually looking at to determine what kind of sentiment or what kind of emotion you're experiencing. But yeah, we can get a very true read. We can tap into the unconscious, that first nanosecond response to stimuli.
Right, okay.
Through this.
Maybe I'm best to let you explain what you're going to be showing people and what they're going to be seeing here today.
Sure.
All right.
Okay. I was. Let me just. I think we might jump over that one. Okay. Earliest memory of fear. I have a very quick first story, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So I wanted to share this with you for a reason, but when I was 6, we lived in a house that backed onto a paddock, and the paddock wasn't ours, but it was a paddock that we would go into through a barbed wire fence, over a creek, up the hill, to the top of the hill, and into this tree. It was a fantastic climbing tree. But the problem was, in that paddock was also a Brahman bull. I don't know if you know Brahman bulls, but they have very big horns. And we were allowed to go and adventure and play in this paddock. It was fine as long as we didn't antagonise the bull. This one day, Mum said we had to get back by a certain time because there was going to be a solar eclipse. And we said, why, what's that? She explained what it was, and she said, if you look, you can lose your sight if you look at the sun. So we thought, wow, okay, we'd better get back. Off we went, out the back of the house, through the barbed wire fence, holding it up for the other person with one hand, one foot, squeezing through the paddock, through the creek, up the hill, all the while looking to see if the Brahman bull was antagonised, and into that tree. And of course, being children, you know, we lost track of time. We did talk about the eclipse and we talked about what it would be like to lose sight, but we lost track of time until we heard the bell. And Mum had this bell that she would ring telling us to come home. And it was usually a lovely, laconic, you know, time to come home, lamb chops are on, whatever. But this day it was a frenetic, get your butts home now ring. And we scrambled down out of that tree and to a sky that was very, very dark and a really eerie light. It was just the strangest feeling. And of course we remembered the eclipse and we thought, right, this isn't good. So we panicked and we started shouting at each other, as children do when they're trying to figure out, I guess, what to make of it. And my sister said, run and close your eyes. So we started down the hill, running, falling over, screaming, eyes closed. I really wanted to know what that bull was doing, so I was just kind of weighing up the losing sight against death by bull, and I decided it'd be great to just take a little squeeze through my fingers. And it was a bit like, I don't know if you've seen that episode of Doctor Who where the angels, you know, it was like, yeah, every time I looked through, it seemed that the bull had suddenly moved to a different position. It was very scary. So we scrambled down the hill. Anyway, back through the paddock, through the creek, through the barbed wire fence, into the house. And Mum was quite amused when she saw us. She realised kind of what we'd been through. But I really still wanted to know what was going on with that bull. And I remember looking out through the curtain and seeing the bull at the barbed wire fence. And it wasn't usually there. So it was definitely, antagonised that day. But the point of the story is that scrambling down that hill, I think fear became a stew of dysfunction. So not only was my brain was scrambling for information, I think, with one source of information down. So I remember that feeling of trying, you know, figuring out how to get down there as quick as possible based on a recollection of what that environment was like. But it was also the hierarchy of fear of, you know, disobeying mother, embarrassing myself in front of the older peers, losing my sight, or death by bull. So there was a lot going on. It was a real tangle. The point of which is to introduce biometrics by saying that we at the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, we are using it, and it might be the start of trying to untangle those kinds of situations and that fear. Not only untangle it, but measure it. We are able to measure what is going on when people are responding to stimuli. So that's my story. Let's move on. Biometric sensors that we are using include galvanic skin response, eye tracking, and facial expression analysis. I'm not going to read that slide to you. I'm sure you're capable of doing it yourself. But suffice to say that the galvanic skin response is you can't lie with this one, and I'm wearing it here so that you can see. It measures skin conductance, slight variations in sweat. We're talking very slight, so not buckets of sweat. And this one in the centre is pulse or heart rate. So that we use, and it's important to combine it with other sensors because this tells us the level of engagement, but it doesn't tell us the type or the valence. We use facial expression analysis and eye tracking to triangulate, and we also build self-reported surveys into the tests. So rather than tell you, I'm going to show you. We did a study this week, for this week called Tapping into Fear. We took 5 clips from YouTube, and we had a small sample group watch these clips, and then we asked them to complete a survey at the end. You can see there's the survey questions there. Identify any clip that you have seen before of the 5. Obviously we needed to know whether it was the first time they were viewing them. Rate the clips according to how scary you found them, and what are your 3 greatest fears? Any questions so far? No? Okay, so I'm going to show you, this may actually autoplay. can see the live tracking, the timeline moving from left to right. That top green line is the heart rate. The second line down is the galvanic skin. And on the video itself, you can see the heat map where people were looking. And this is an aggregate of all across the whole sample group.
So the green's a heart rate.
The top green line is heart rate.
The second,
The blue is the galvanic skin response, so sweat and pulse.
And what's the third blue that's really quite
That's the
emphasised?
valence. So that is, as I said, it's an aggregate of all, but that actually tells us that the type of engagement, be it joy, sadness, contempt, disgust, fear, surprise, yeah, and there's another one. It's probably there. That tells us that the levels of one or more of those is increasing or decreasing.
Okay.
And we're looking at event-related peaks on those reads.
So can you tell us, what are those peaks on this that we're seeing there?
Event-related peaks. So that's telling us on the, which one? The blue?
Oh, the lowest blue?
Yeah, so wherever you
Yeah.
see a peak, that's where the aggregate is that people were experiencing that.
Right.
And of course, as I said, this is all based on the facial expression analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just tiny micro expressions. It's not even necessarily visible to the human eye with the facial recognition, with the facial expression analysis. Yeah, I want to show you the next clip.
Did everyone follow that?
Oh,
Yep.
next clip. This one I call spider ear. Just so you know what's in there.
You've got the heat sensors over it. That's probably protecting you all.
You can see people are really looking at that little spider's eyes. Some people, well, it may be an avoidance, the green dots outside, away from the spider. Or it might be that they're interested in the earring or... So he's coming out, he or she, spider.
Spider ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ.
Is there another spider inside there?
Inside
That's what
the
I'm
ear?
wondering. I thought there was a second one, but maybe it's
You're
just
an
me.
optimist, that's
I'm-
fantastic.
yeah.
I don't know.
Sorry.
I'm sure that family, that spider has friends, yeah. Okay, let's look at the next one. Has anyone seen this before?
Yeah, okay.
Good music in this one. Notice the galvanic skin response aggregate in these results, quite high all the way through. So the heat map we can see looking at the door handle,
Yeah.
looking at her eyes, then her mouth. Looking at her eye. What is she thinking? What's she feeling? What's she going to do? Sorry about that. Right.
These guys got a feature film deal out of that, so you know.
How are we all feeling? Good?
That's interesting though, the way that you can see how the focus in on the eyes, how people do look at the eyes.
That's a cat. Apparently the cat was not harmed in the making of that commercial.
It was caught in the actual the what do you call it?
Sunroof.
Sunroof. The sunroof of the car. So actually Penn said that was a banned ad. It ended up getting banned. So you couldn't see it as well there, which is probably okay. But apparently the cat's okay.
But you can see also with the read, the data read there, right at the end, it just shoots up because, of course, that's horrendous. Okay, last one. I took the data. Have you seen it?
You know this one? Yeah.
Some of the ad. I've watched it so many times and it gets me every time.
It's terrible. Does anyone speak German? You know what that means? Oh, we don't. Anyway. I think that's the interesting thing is also sound, how sound is so important in playing into the fear and creating this sense of fear. So yes, go on with the results.
All right. In summary, indeed, but just curious to know, which video do you think participants rated as the most scary? Just show of hands. Water cave, spider ear, home horror, cat car, scenic zombie. Okay. Which video do you think that Biometrics measured the highest level of engagement? Water cave, spider ear, home horror, cat car, scenic zombie. All right, before we get to the results, let's just have a quick look at question 2. Just so you know, very few of our respondents had seen any of those clips. Only one had seen spider ear and 2 had seen scenic drive. So that was a really good baseline for us. Question 2, rank each clip according to how scary you found it. You can see that the scariest was considered to be home horror, quite scary. There are 5 participants that said it was quite scary. 4 said a little scary, but it's the only one that had 0. The only one that had 0 responses for not scary at all. The scenic drive was 3 at quite scary, 3 at very scary, 2 highest ranking. So we asked, what are your 3 greatest fears? Most people I find are able to fairly quickly tell you what their 3 greatest fears are. There was a very high level of drowning and fears associated with drowning, so deep water, darkness, the dark, and a combination darkness underwater. Yet the water cave was not considered to be a scary video, so interesting. Spiders, snakes, cockroaches, reptiles, heights, falling, bungee jumping. Again, the spiders, that was a low ranking in terms of people thinking it was scary or not, yet it's one of the highest fears. Death, dying alone, blood, dead body, and then there were a few randoms, so bankruptcy, crashing into a track. I think some of these were quite specific because people actually had experienced them and were afraid of reliving it. So where is it? Breaking my knee again would definitely fall into that category. And then more esoteric, not having enough time to see the world, creaking sounds, things like that. Okay. So, moving right along, these are our biometric results. You are right. A lot of you said that home horror was definitely the highest in terms of galvanic skin response, 45.5% aggregate across. And scenic drive and cat car came in second, but as you can see, much lower at 27.3. Facial expression, you can see there, scenic drive, anger was the highest. So I don't know if people are saying, yeah, get that zombie, or maybe they didn't like scenic drive. Do you think?
I think there's a response of people, they feel angry that they've been scared by that, especially a jump scare.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of, they feel cheated.
Yeah.
Jump scares, I think people feel cheated, yeah.
Right. I mean, these inferences you can make, but we don't know. We'd have to do a lot more questioning to find out. Sadness, the only ranking for sadness was car cat, which is nice to see. Disgust, scenic drive, again. I guess they found the zombie very unattractive. Joy, scenic drive. So joy registered, as you can see across there, highly in most of them compared to other emotions. So I'm wondering if that's a defense mechanism that we use when we see something that frightens us. Do we laugh? I don't know. Surprise, spider ear. I think people were surprised to see there was a spider in that ear. Fear, look at that, 0 across. So that's a talking point. Contempt, scenic drive at 0.105. Any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
That's interesting. Here we're sitting here talking about the psychology of fear. We've got 0 right across there. So is the perception of fear really a combination of other elements into one?
Nick?
What do you think, Nick?
No, I mean, I think fear is quite basic. I'm not. There might be something just specific about how it was measured in this case. I mean, I think disgust is fascinating, and I was going to talk about that later. But it is one of those things where a lot of these experiences aren't just, it's not just dread of something bad happening to you, it's a kind of icky revulsion. And so it's not surprising that the home horror one, which to me was actually quite scary, and I think you can relate to that, but there's nothing icky about it. It's more, there's just this kind of freaky woman in my bedroom. That's not how it sounded. Whereas, there's a kind of moral disgust at the cat. How could that horrible car try to eat that beautiful cat? There's the disgust at the disgusting, spider, and the horrible ghoulish figure in the scenic drive. I think disgust is different from fear. It had been ignored as an emotion until quite recently, but and it certainly can combine with fear. So probably what you're getting there, I think you could define horror almost as a kind of merging of disgust and fear in revulsion.
Okay.
Kim, I've got a question. In regards to disgust and fear, do you think that fear is something that's I wouldn't say it's easily forgotten, but in terms of something that's staying with you, like an emotion, like it's something, a spider coming out of fear, is that more likely to stay with you than fear? Does that make sense?
In the short term, or in
in the short term, like how after watching these videos, did they ask these questions straight away, or was there some time that was
Straight away. So they watched the sequence, and it wasn't random. It was a specific sequence, and that you've seen here, and then the survey slide at the end.
I can ask
Oh,
a
sorry.
question. It seems like we're kind of lured into seeing more and more horrific things, even on the news, or hearing it on the news, and then by the time we hear that only 4,000 people died in that volcano, it's just like a fact that just slides away. So it's not just the horror, but it's the perception of the horrific things going on that we just kind of let go of, and that we're not horrified by as well. So it's kind of the opposite of being fearful and horrified by something, is almost being anesthetized to the horror that's going on. That's kind of mixed with it's almost like news shows do all this horrific news broadcasting, and then they say we have one good story, and then they throw in a good story, as if that's the news of what's going on in the world, which is it's totally slanted. So I'm wondering if there's any research around whether they actually look at that this is, people only want to hear about really horrific things, and then maybe one good story. And that's kind of the question and the comment.
It's a good research question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think they wouldn't do it if it didn't, sell ads.
Yeah.
So obviously at some level the public likes it, but the public also gets desensitized to it. I think you're quite right. But it's different hearing about it on the news and actually seeing it in person. So you could watch the last of those videos 10 times and eventually your response will dampen down. But generally, I think there's a difference between vicariously experienced horror and directly experienced personal horror, which more could be written about, I'm sure.
I still think there is a certain distance that's given when you, on the news, when you, like you said, you're given these facts or statistics, and when you actually think about them, they're absolutely horrific. But I remember, for example, Rosie's documentary about Anne Hamilton Byrne, who in the 80s, and hearing those news reports, and there's an element of, oh, that's shocking. But then when you actually watch the documentary and dig closer and get closer, because there's something of a removal from the action with the news, except for sensationalist headlining and certain language that can be used in certain newspapers and so on, that makes it more clinical. And then once you're provided with the detailing, that's what gives the emotional response. For example, where we saw with Penn's clips, how everyone focused in on the eyes of the person, because that is the detail. That's where you're getting that direct response, and you're actually creating a link between you and that person and what they're feeling.
That's where the mirror neurons are coming in too, with screen content particularly, that we are, when we're watching someone experiencing something, we're actually, our brain, a part of our brain, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, we are experiencing that ourselves.
Right.
Can I ask what the joy, just joy, what do you mean by that? Because that struck me more as a bit like a nervousness or a relief.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, it's just a thought that perhaps it's a defence mechanism. When we're afraid, we laugh. Are we embarrassed or? Yeah, yeah. So the facial expression registers as joy, as they're universally recognised emotions that map against the facial expressions, the micro expressions. So it registers as joy. Laughter may be in response to seeing something that's frightened us, but yeah, if we're talking in terms of the analysis, that's how it registers.
So then what was the facial response? Sorry. What was the facial response then to fear? What were you measuring exactly?
They're just, it's mapped against landmark points on the face. So it's things like the position of your eyebrows, your mouth, your nose, everything mapping at one time to register that particular emotion.
Could that also suggest that maybe the way that we think about our response to fear is not wrong, but like, is there something that we're missing?
Absolutely, I think that's a really good, interesting point.
Very interesting. So is that the end of that study
That's me.
there, Pen? Okay.
Yeah.
Now Rosie's not a fan of horror, but she's a fan of true crime. It's interesting because we are using true crime as sort of the hook tonight, but there are definitely varying levels of what, we talk about a horror movie, for example, and horror can mean a number of different things to different people. So I think that true crime can still fit within that realm, even though that you don't think that. But what would you say draws you to it, to this subject in particular, the Anne Hamilton Byrne sect subject?
Right. Well, I actually came across it accidentally. I'm not really somebody going out looking for a true crime story, I guess, but I was investigating a mystery about a UFO that was hovering above a school and 250 people saw it and there was a cover-up. So I was investigating this particular story when I came across a woman who was involved in the sect, and she started to tell me about the things that had happened to her, which I guess you would call them horrific, really, but in a real sense of the word horrific, I guess. She had been taken to a hospital, she had been given LSD, put under electroconvulsive therapy, and then introduced to this woman, Anne Hamilton Byrne, who was at the time a yoga teacher. And she had been drawn into this sect, and basically it had wrecked her life. So the things that fascinated me were the story of this psychiatric hospital where you generally go to get fixed, and in fact that had been the beginning of her downfall. So I guess again that's a kind of a horrific story in a different way. I started digging into this story, and I discovered that there were a couple of detectives who had been involved in a police investigation, and I made contact with them. I started to get involved in the investigation, and I thought this is a good way to tell this story. So I guess using the genre of the detective story, I thought that would be an interesting way, and a very sort of organic way to tell the story of this sect. Maybe it would be a good point at which to just have I don't know if people have actually seen the film, but if we could have a look at the trailer, it might give you a bit of an idea.
Okay. Do we do that?
Do we? I'm not sure. Oh.
Let's see if we do.
I don't know. I think there's... Phew.
I'm looking right at each one of you. You are the initiate. You are the cosmic being.
Auntie Anne was the head of the family. Under the influence of LSD, she had this vision that she's got to collect all these children from birth, because one day there's going to be World War III where most of the world's going to perish. She was preparing us for when the time happens to re-educate the world.
I'm wondering if you've got any comment to make now about what happened to the children. You know what happened to those children. You know everything that happened.
Well, investigations are still underway into a religious sect known as the Family. 6 children were seized from a property owned by the sect.
The sect was made up of professional people who worshipped Anne Hamilton Byrne as Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form.
Only one rule: total obedience.
I didn't want to have the LSD. They tried everything to make me agree.
People around the lake would hear us screaming.
And you remember absolute terror.
I would just sit on my bed, frozen as a statue, just staring out the window.
28 young people went through our hands.
Why did you?
I love children.
He's going to be with me for the rest of my life.
What happened to those kids is giving me nightmares.
Does anyone know of this story? Everyone's familiar with it? All right, so we don't have to go through it too much. But Rosie, I'd like you to tell us, why do you think that we're morbidly fascinated with this story?
Well, I think quite a bit of it has got to do with that last image of the blonde kids. I think it's arresting. There's something about their eyes that is, they're sort of impenetrable in a way. It's weird. It's a bit like The Sound of Music, but not. It's like Village of the Damned. And because it used to be called the Great White Brotherhood, there's an element of the sort of Aryan heroic figures, Nazism. I think it brings together a whole lot of images and thoughts and associations that are scary and familiar, and it's haunting, I think. So I think that's something that captured people's imagination. I mean, the media at the time there was a police raid back in 1987, and several kids were removed from this property, and there was like a media frenzy really, because they were weird. There was this blonde, charismatic woman, quite voluptuous and sexy, who thought she was Jesus Christ reincarnated, and that's weird. There was this element of the gothic environments in which they lived. There were drugs. There was a psychiatric institution that again was a sort of a spooky mansion. There were doctors with big syringes sticking them into kids who were, teenagers. It's sort of like a real Grimm's fairy tale crossed with, and then there were the detectives. So this whole detective investigation that followed it. I think it's got a lot of elements all jumbled up together that fascinate us. I was personally fascinated because it was a middle class sect. So the people that got involved in this group were well educated, they had connections to all sorts of intelligent and powerful people. And so I think when you're watching a film about people like that, you're going, how can they possibly be drawn into this thing? Why would they listen to this woman and follow her? And I think you're also going, well, could I do that? Is there any point at which I would be convinced to follow this woman? And I mean, my feeling is no way. But she had a whole lot of strategies that she would use to get people to read people's responses. I mean, she must have had some sort of meter on people, because she could actually just find out what people's weaknesses were and target them. And I think we're fascinated by bad people.
How people can be like that.
How people can be ruthless and controlling, and I guess the word evil is tossed around. I don't really see her as evil, but a lot of people describe her as evil, whatever that is. There were people in the film who really admired her because of her badness. How does she get away with that? So that's another element, I think, of fascination. The fact that this happened in a very conservative middle-class suburb. It was under the radar, but at the same time it was people like us. It was normal people doing, if anyone doesn't know about it, there were a number of people called aunties and uncles who looked after the blonde kids, and they ended up doing quite horrific things to them. There was a lot of child abuse. But these women were registered nurses and men. They were mostly nurses. They were in the caring profession, and yet they had been convinced by the way that she drew them in and the way that she manipulated their psychology. They'd been convinced to do these terrible things. And I think part of the attraction is the horror that us normal people can do these terrible things. And I think you're always watching something like this going, could I do it?
Yeah. That's interesting, because I've seen a lot of documentaries about cults, and they're all, we're talking about David Koresh or, Jonestown stuff and so forth. But this is in Melbourne, and it's kind of, it feels like that, similar to the looking into the eyes of someone. This is us looking into our own eyes. It's very close for us here in Australia. So have you found that that's been an interesting response from people, like the audiences here in Australia?
It was an incredible, when we screened it at the Melbourne Film Festival, it was an incredible response, because I think everybody knew somebody who had been associated with it. And yes, it was like looking into your own eyes and going, how the hell did that happen? And also, how did we let that happen?
Yeah.
Why did we not see what was going on? So I think, yes, it was very, very, very familiar, and yet so strange, so very strange and inexplicable. So it was an incredible response. I mean, I was really, I didn't expect to see so many young people coming along to see the film when we screened it at the Nova, for example, which is a university area. But young people seem to be really fascinated, and I thought it would probably appeal more to people from the 80s, say, 70s and 80s, who had been around when it was happening. But actually, and I don't know whether that was because they identified closely with the kids, maybe. I don't know. Or they were closer to that age and they could relate to the powerlessness, I suppose, that those children experienced, because they had absolutely no control over their lives. They didn't actually know who they were. Their identities were taken away. And that's a very scary thing to have happen to you when it's revealed to you that it's happened. You don't realise at the time, but afterwards that's quite frightening. And I was also amazed to see how many women were in the audience. It was very female skewed, which I think is the way that horror and true crime and so on, it's consumed by women. And I think that may be because we are in a rather more precarious position than men. I guess the violence perpetrated in the world is perpetrated more against women than by women. I mean, there's certainly women who murder and women who do atrocious things, as you know, I've discovered in the film.
That's interesting. Maybe,
are we, I don't know.
Maybe we'll throw that to Nick, see if, what do you think of that, Nick, that observation?
Well, I think it's certainly true. I can't argue with any of that. But I think it has changed. I mean, my sense is that if you were to ask, 30 years ago, who would most like horror movies, and the studies actually showed this, it was men. And the fact that it's turned and become, differently gendered, I think is quite interesting, and it's partly because, as Rosie was saying, the consumption of this is intensely empathic. It's not just going in there to identify with someone who's slashing someone, who's harming someone. It's to understand it, is to make sense of it, to make sense of... And being in a precarious position might contribute to that, but I think, women more generally are more likely to be involved imaginatively in culture. It's just a fact of life. And whether there's anything specific to this genre, I don't know. But I think there's been an interesting historical change there. And I think it's largely driven by the fact that women on average, with massive overlaps in the distributions, are more interested in the life of the mind. And that's what this is about.
Speaking of such things, as an observer, a filmmaker, a professional observer, what have you learnt about the criminal mind, or what have been the surprises from doing this documentary?
Well, I don't think I have learned a lot about the criminal mind, because I don't see her and her cohorts as criminals, actually. I don't see it as a criminal mind. She was ruthless and cruel and cunning and a whole lot of other pretty unpleasant adjectives, but I actually think she was mentally ill rather than criminal. And so, in fact, in her family there was a history of mental illness. Her mother was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and she spent 30 years in an asylum and then died in an asylum, and other sort of mental health problems in Anne's backstory. So to me, it's a story about mental health rather than criminality. And yes, she did criminal things, but as a result of, I think, probably good intentions that went bad, because I don't know about the definition, because nobody's actually been able to test her. I don't know whether she's still alive, a sociopath, a psychopath. I don't quite know how to define these things, and I guess nobody's really tested her in any way.
She's actually, is she about 98
She's
now?
96.
96, and she's actually, she's got dementia, so you cannot question her at the moment. And I know Rosie,
I would have loved her.
Rosie has actually met her, which she said was a very scary experience. What was that interaction like, Rosie?
It was incredible, really, going into the dementia wing of this place and seeing Anne Hamilton Byrne, who had collected around her a whole bunch of children and who weren't her own, and she was cradling this doll in her arms. And in dementia wards they often have dolls or soft toys, soft animals but she had this doll in her arms and she was incredibly tender and she was looking after this doll. And she said, you know, Bill and I, we had 6 or 8 children together. She was still telling the story, even though they had no children together. She actually had one daughter, but they had no children. Even in her state of dementia, she was, I suppose, what I would call delusional.
Yeah, exactly.
As a non-expert. She's still living the delusion, and around the walls were all these pictures of the kids and the happy life that she had tried to create. So it was just really a weird experience. Yeah.
I'll allow you to ask some questions of Rosie a little bit. Hold off for a moment. Well, just what I'll do is I'll get Nick to round off everything, and then we'll all ask questions. So hold on to that. Hold on to your thoughts. Nick, in terms of what is the difference between, what would you say, the criminal mind and the person who's interested in the criminal mind?
Well, I think it's probably fairly basic. It's rather like the difference between a footballer and someone who's interested in football.
Okay.
You know, one person, the mind is dedicated to doing something, and the other is dedicated to understanding it or living vicariously through it. You know, the criminal mind, such as it is basically trying to meet some goal. You know, you rob the bank because that's where the money is, you know, to use the famous quote. Whereas I think the person who's interested in reading about or watching films about crime wants to either, you know, vicariously live through that experience and inhabit that person's psyche as an imaginative exercise, or just have some sort of entertainment experience, you know, or to understand perhaps. I think, you know, it sounds like there was a real wrestling with the understanding of this very complex and clearly delusional individual.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Is it ever that perhaps seeing someone else experiencing something bad alleviates the pain of the self? So would people drawn to watching horror perhaps be doing so because their own life is painful?
I think there's all sorts of reasons, and again, the motives for this can be quite different. So, I was just reading this afternoon one of the studies on this. You know, it distinguished 4 different motives for enjoying or watching horror movies, and I'll probably forget at least one of them. But you know, one of them was mostly young males who were sort of cheering on the guy in the hockey mask, identifying with the perpetrator and just treating it purely as entertainment. And then there was a certain bunch of people who were doing it motivated primarily by the social experience. You know, it's the classic date movie kind of scenario. And then there was some who were doing it primarily for distraction, you know, who were unhappy, lonely, angry, watching these movies alone, and not feeling better afterwards. So it might have been intended to relieve some sort of personal distress, but it wasn't succeeding in that. So I think you just can't generalise about a single motivation at all.
Like what Rosie was talking about, is there, because seems to be something that does come up a lot about whether it's someone's a criminal or whether they're mentally ill, or can you be both?
Of course, I mean, I think the different discourses. Crime is a legal concept. You can commit a crime whether or not you're mentally ill. Now, if you're mentally ill when you commit the crime, maybe some sort of mitigation is appropriate. But I think they're just 2 alternative ways of describing things. Now, I think crimes appear to have been committed here. The perpetrator appears to have been psychotic. That does put the crime in a different kind of context, but crimes are still committed regardless. But I think they're different. The psychiatric discourse and the legal discourse are really different. And what a psychiatrist means by psychosis and what a lawyer means by insanity, totally different ideas, let alone criminality.
There was something I think you wanted to talk about with regards to disgust as an emotion. Did you get a chance to talk through everything you wanted to on that?
I'm happy to leave time for
to
people
the audience
to talk, except... well, I think it's a really important emotion, and it's one of those things which is obviously sort of triggered by a lot of these sorts of ideas, and horror, I think, uniquely targets that, both with the sort of mangled bodies and with the monstrous beings and with the sort of scary insects and animals and things like that. And I really wanted to tell just one story from my brief clinical career. It'll take 30 seconds.
No,
So when I thought we were going to be talking about morbid stuff and gore, which we didn't talk about much, but that's probably a good thing. I did my clinical training in America when people were still using the Rorschach test. People know the Rorschach ink blots. It's been mostly abandoned because it's almost entirely invalid. But there's you score it up in part. One thing you look for is people who have morbid content. So certain people see lots of blood and bones and guts and things, and that's usually thought to be a bad sign, as you might not be surprised to hear. So one of the first people I tested kept seeing bones. That's a pelvis and that's a femur and that's a scapula. And I thought, oh God, this person's seriously depressed or potentially a psychopathic killer. No, it turned out she worked in a radiology lab.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what she sees every day. Yeah. Okay. And there's a lady in the middle. Just you need to get the microphone. We want to hear you. The world wants to hear you. It's online. No.
Sorry, I just had a question, or maybe more of a suggestion about the gender thing that you were talking about before. So particularly female obsession with or consumption of true crime. I was listening to something recently that suggested that that's because it's more likely that women will warn each other about danger. So part of the reason that increasingly, maybe as we approach or achieve motherhood, we're more likely to seek out extraordinary and infrequent crime, like serial killers and child snatchers and things, because we want to signal that to each other and kind of warn the community or our loved ones or our children about that danger.
That's
Do
interesting.
you feel like maybe that's true?
I think a lot of these things are really, certainly with biometrics, that's coming from that standpoint, is that a lot of the reads are connected to very ancient parts of our brains and ways of communication that go right back. And yeah, that's my starting point for that.
Yeah, look, I think you're almost certainly right. But I don't think it has to only be about communicating it to others. It makes perfect sense to try to get inside the head of someone who might be like someone who could harm you. So I would understand part of that obsession with true crime, which I don't get, but which my wife is completely obsessed with, is to understand a real kind of danger, to try to, it makes sense to understand what the threats are. And there's more threats to you than there are to me.
Even though it's statistically very unlikely that, a serial killer or a child snatcher or something would occur.
Well, but it's the same with a lot of things we're afraid of. People are very, very afraid of snakes. What's the risk of actually being killed by a snake bite in Australia? It's almost zero. It's close to zero. But people are still very intensely afraid of some of these evolutionarily prepared fears. And, spiders, snakes, and scary men are, evolutionarily real threats that people, ought to be concerned about. Now, of course, some are more concerned than they ought to be rationally, but it makes sense to try to understand it and master it.
Anyone else got questions? We need the mic, yes.
When I was listening to you, Rose, on the radio, speaking about the whole sect, the things that were occurring to me was that ritual and trance are so important. So we all think we're not, for example, in a trance, and yet most of our life is trance-like. And our bodies are highly ritualistic, so you can teach your body to drive a car and it drives you and you don't really have to think about much. So when you think about someone utilizing just those two aspects of ourselves, it's not unusual to think that somebody could actually do what she did. And so many of the sects and so many of the religions, in fact, they kind of use the same things. So when you come across something and it looks like it's more on the evil or the bad spectrum, even that's a matter of opinion as to which side of the use of those kinds of things is on. When you're looking at whether it's a crime or it's a psychological thing, do you have difficulty wondering where it is on that fence? Whether it's on this side or that side, and how much it is of all of us, but we just don't go quite as far as someone who's leading a sect?
Ooh. Okay. I'm not sure I quite understand your question.
Okay.
Can you put it in a more
Well, I
concrete?
think when we're watching someone do something to an extreme, we
Right.
think that that's so unusual, but they've just taken it a little bit further than we have.
Oh, I think she took it a lot further.
Yeah.
I think she strategized how to do it. You're absolutely right about trance and ritual, and I think a very powerful part of the sect was the fact that people were given LSD. And they weren't just given one trip, they were continually given a trip. And she would come into the room and she would find out their weakest points, the things that they were feeling the most guilty about. And then she would blackmail them with that. I think that's going a bit further than most of us would do. So I guess the outcomes of what she did were so damaging and destructive that I think she certainly veered onto the bad side. But yes, I mean, I agree with your premise about ritual and so on. Yes, very, very powerful and key to any sect. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's good.
Anyone else got a question to ask? Lady in the middle.
I just had a question sort of on what you spoke about, Rosie, in terms of the engagement for your documentary and sort of who you thought might come along, as well as, you know, lots of young people, different people. I haven't actually seen the documentary yet, but I plan to. I was wondering if you spoke with the law enforcement, obviously, that were aware post all the activities, if you spoke to people who lived in the area nearby who weren't involved in the cult and what was known sort of locally about that, because I feel like that's a big part of our fascination, is not just understanding the psychology of how could someone do this, but also that horror of this was going on right near us and in our community. You know, how did people not see that this was happening?
Yeah.
Did you get to talk to locals?
Oh, we did masses of sessions up at the Cameo, which is in the Dandenongs, and it was packed and everybody knew somebody, and you know, people had all these things to tell us which they hadn't probably told anybody at the time, unfortunately. So there was an absolute sense of, I think it was very cathartic for that community, because they knew stuff, but everybody had been a bystander. And I think I don't know how that relates to horror and true crime and so on, but I think there was some sort of a purging, or it was quite unusual. It was sort of just very, very intense, and so many people were related to people or related to somebody who was related. It was quite extraordinary. Yes, there was another part of your question, but I'm not...
Well, not so much another part, but just I feel like that's a massive draw to a lot of people who are into true crime like myself. The idea that these things are happening, and where are the signs and how do we see them, but also if you've seen them, how did people not speak up about them?
I think, in fact, there was a lot of guilt involved. I think people did feel a bit as though they should have spoken out, but it was a different time, and children weren't believed at that time. We're talking a long time ago now. There were a whole lot of attitudes have changed, but in fact, there was one person who came to a screening. He was the piano tuner who used to go into the property that was so isolated, and he'd gone in there. They were all taught the piano, and tuned that piano, and he said he felt something was wrong, but he didn't do anything.
That connects to that collective idea that the gentleman in the front row was talking about earlier. That collective, I agree with that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just about that, I haven't watched the family, but
could you bring the mic up a little bit more?
I haven't watched that documentary, but it's the first thing I'm going to do when I get home. I just have a question. I'm not from here, I'm from Europe. Is there, like, when you found this cult and this story and you found so fascinated about it, did you find there was a sort of, because of the isolation of this country, of Australia, and how all the spaces and everything is so much farther away, like, did you find that this was something that was common back in the 60s, 70s? Like, was this the first case of something like that happening here? Or is this something that's happened before?
It's something I think there's been cults forever, and there probably always will be cults. I mean, this was different in the fact that she was a female leader, which is unusual. You're asking about the isolation, desolation?
And yeah, in terms of, is this something that may happen more often back in those days in Australia because of the isolation?
Of Australia
Yeah.
from other places?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it was about isolation. In fact, I think cults are something that happen all around the world and they connect us in a way. I think it's behaviour that happens all over the place. So, no, I don't think it's to do with our isolation.
Okay.
No. I mean, interesting idea, but no.
Oh, it's just because you were talking about the property being so isolated and it was within the community but out of the community at the same time. So it's just made me wonder, because one of the things you pick first when you get here as a foreigner is that everything is far away.
Right. Yeah.
And
it's amazing where you can
just
find pockets
wondering.
of isolation, though. Like Americans have found, cults have found a lot of isolation.
Yeah. It's the same case in
Yeah.
America, exactly, because
Yeah.
covers a whole bloody
Yes.
continent, but it's, yeah.
I guess they found isolated places in which to secrete themselves. And they did actually have a property in America and another one in Kent.
Mm.
And they were all very similar.
Wow.
Very remote, a bit remote, although
Yep.
they had neighbours. They all must have had neighbours who didn't really look out very much or didn't want to talk.
Yeah.
But very sort of treed properties where the house was hidden. It was sort of shrouded in mystery. They had quite a bit of space around them. So they weren't cheek by jowl with anyone. So they did tend to go to places that were somewhat isolated, quite dank and kind of damp.
They were malnourished too, weren't they?
Sorry?
They were malnourished. The children were
Oh, the children
hungry.
was a bit
Yeah.
starved, yes.
Yeah.
A bit starved.
A bit
Yes,
starved.
A bit starved. Yes.
And Julian
Thank
Assange
you.
was one of the children too. Julian Assange was also one of the children.
Is that true?
Well, he wasn't one of the children. His stepfather had been in the cult, and him and his mother were running away from the stepfather. That's the story that he's put out there. So he wasn't actually one of the blondes.
Okay, but
Yeah.
he's. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me from this?
Yeah.
Okay. Certainly, one of the versions from his mother was that he was treated like that, and that's what she had him taken away from. What I wanted to say, though, was just an observation. Having recently reread 1984 by George Orwell, a lot of the treatment was very much what was used by Big Brother in order to change people's attitudes and define their fears so they could be brainwashed and forced to renounce democracy, mostly. So I found it quite interesting hearing this today.
Yeah, I think it's a very good parallel.
We'll go to this lady first because it's easier to go to you.
You can
take it.
oh.
Oh, okay. The two of you. All right.
This is mostly for Nick. I was just wondering about the biometric testing that AFTRS is doing. Is it fair to say that, say, fear is more based on knowledge and anticipation of something occurring, like a knowledge of a risk or knowledge of a threat, and that imaginative anticipation of something occurring, whereas emotions like disgust and contempt are more reactionary to being shown something?
Yeah, I think it's a really nice way of capturing it. I mean, fear, in theory, is about something bad is going to happen in the future, the near future. If it's anxiety, usually it's say in the more distant future, worry that some bad thing might happen. So yeah, fear is prospective, whereas disgust and contempt are usually, as you say, the thing has happened and I'm repulsed by it and put it out of my sight. And I think that sort of time perspective of the emotions is quite interesting. And it's, I think you can split hairs about these sorts of things, but there's a distinction, for instance, between, terror and horror, which is kind of relevant to a lot of things. So I think there was, terror in I'm obsessed with this one now, this clip you showed me. The lady hiding under the bedclothes, something bad is going to happen, and that's, you're currently at that stage feeling, intense fear or terror, if you like. But when there's this horrible realization that the thing has come to pass, that's the horror. So I think these things do all have quite different time courses, and I think the biometrics is a fascinating way of tackling it.
If you look at the read on that too, it was high all the way through. So there was what you're talking about, fear and the anticipation of what's going to happen, whereas with the zombie, it was lower, and then, so it's fear or fright, I think, two different things.
But if you'd told us that there was going to be a zombie later on in that one, like you maybe should have.
I jumped. I've seen it so many times.
Then it would have slowly risen because we knew it would be coming. But I think that's the interesting thing about the biometrics is that emotions have lots of different channels. There's the communicative channel via the face. There's the physiology that the biometrics is picking up here. There's a subjective feeling. And those three channels don't necessarily correspond very well. Yeah, and one of the cool things about this technology is that it shows you when one of the channels might be operating up before you're even conscious of it. And likewise, there can be a disjunction between what people say they're afraid of and what they show they're afraid of, or disgusted by, or contemptuous of, or whatever. So it's just a fascinating area.
If anyone's interested in seeing the technology or coming to the school and talking, you can contact me through the school website afters.
Yes.
Do we have time for both of us to still talk?
I think so.
Oh, okay. Hello, I'll be brief. I just wanted to ask, do you think with the psychology of fear, do you think there could be a link between fear and empathy with our interest in true crime? I guess coming from one of my perspectives, I was so interested in true crime growing up, but I was seeing it more so from the perspective of the perpetrator and what's actually caused them to do it. So one of my favourite films is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but one of the things that draws me so much, the gore, it's a horror film, yes, but whenever I think of it, I feel so sorry for Leatherface, and I just feel so much for what he has been through. And then with other aspects of true crime, they're so horrific, the things of it. And I think it was when you were talking, Rosie, about how she'd grown up, what kind of experiences she'd had, and even horrific things of the West and all different kinds of things like that. Do you think that there is a link between fear and empathy with the resurgence of in popular culture that maybe we're... Am I making sense?
Yeah, I do love that you feel sorry for Leatherface.
Bless. I know. There's not much of me around. Do you think that there could be the reason why we're more interested now in true crime because, or maybe that perhaps women being more empathetic from what people have said and studies have shown that maybe that could be why we're more interested in true crime than what we have been before?
Can you measure empathy in biometrics? You can't really, can you?
Let's see. I have to think about that. Well, if it's a combination of other emotions, perhaps. What do you think?
Look, I think empathy is is really complex. It's not a single thing. So I think you're right, but you're probably right in several different ways. So on the one hand, if you didn't have any empathy at all, you'd feel nothing because you wouldn't identify at all with the person who's being slashed up or the poor little Leatherface who's had a horrible childhood or whatever, I don't know. So you need a certain base level of empathy just to respond at all to any stimulus involving other people. Now, and I think you're quite right, a lot of the motivation, I think, underlying consumption of these genres is trying to make sense of other people's minds, especially minds different from your own. And it could be identifying with with villains or victims or both. So you need a certain amount of that. Having said that, you can have too much empathy. So I think, what you find is, seriously, and empathy has different, as I said, different flavours. One reason I don't like horror is I'm just very squeamish, and maybe it's because I'm empathic, maybe it's just because I'm a bit of a wuss. But I think if you empathise too much, if the pain you see on the screen goes too strongly to yourself, it's very aversive. And a lot of people, and this is not just me talking, have shown that those who have more intense empathic reactions of the sort, what she's feeling, I'm feeling, find this a very aversive sort of thing, and they're not going to they're not going to be interested in that genre at all. So you see that you need a certain amount of a certain kind of empathy to relate at all. Having empathy to try to understand different perspectives and different minds is probably a major motivation for some people. Having too much of this sort of emotional contagion from what's on the screen to what's in my heart, that can be to make you not want to watch. So empathy is all those different things and more.
Thank you.
Gentleman down the back.
This is the last question. Yeah. What odds would there be of you four getting in a room and coming up with the quote-unquote greatest horror or thriller of all time? Because I know Emma could write it, Rosie could direct, and Nick and Pen could probably...
I could inform the editorial process, which is what we're trying to do with this.
Come up with the triggers that are going to send people into this spiral of, I never want to watch that film again.
Nick can be our
I wouldn't be
serial
able to
killer.
watch it.
The psychologist is a serial killer. Ta-da! That was great. I think I'll finish on the clip that I said I was going to show you guys. So in that, so long ago, in that initial passage that I read out from Adam Simon, he talked about mystery as well, and this interest in mystery. And I think that true crime as well has an element of mystery about it. We're playing detectives through the filmmaker. And sometimes in something like the one that we've got actually in our graphic there, Making a Murderer, there is the mystery continues. We're still weighing up whether he is an actual killer or not. Sometimes though, there are ones that are a little bit more transparent in whether they're real or not, and I'm going to show you one that I think is quite transparent. Hopefully you'll feel the same way. It comes from the satanic panic craze of the 80s, and I got to see this clip at the launch of a book called Satanic Panic that's edited by Kayla Janice and Paul Carupe. And it was actually, this isn't a true news item that was played on the Today Show in 1984 in the US. So it's got a little bit of preamble from the journalist at the start, but then it gets right into it. So,
in the beginning, it was a little hard to believe, and I'd just go home at night and I say, "Wow, this is crazy. This is a little too weird for me." But after 4 years, you kind of get into the swing of it. It becomes normal. I mean, after you've seen our haunted toaster.
Right here where it says put one slice, we heard, "I am the devil."
What kind of voice did the devil have?
A very low voice, I'd say sounded like Eli Wallach.
Have you saved any of this satanic toast?
Yes, I did save it because I wanted to be sure that somebody else would see it. Now this one, can you see that, Richard? Satan lives. Just terrible.
Is the toaster still possessed?
We still have trouble off and on with it, yes. Oh, see, now it's...
I just hold it down.
It seems to be aware. Oh!
Why have you kept this toaster?
Well, Richard, you know, when all is said and done, it makes good toast.
For today, Boyd Matson, NBC News, Boca Raton, Florida.
There you go. So believe it or not, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Can you please thank the panel? And thanks to you too.